Okay, hello everyone. It's 2:30. I'm happy to welcome you to this inaugural lecture today with our new under-visiting professor in Geomedia studies, Professor Kaarina Nikunen from Tampere University in Finland. My name is, as you know, I'm Andre Jansson. I'm the director of the Geomedia research group, and I will be the chair of this session. Before we start, I want to say that this is a hybrid event, which means that we are a little group here in the auditorium, and then we are also a group online following this event. And I want to say that it's also being recorded, so everyone should be aware of this, that it's the lecture is recorded and it might also be published online later on. The under-visiting professorship has been awarded by our department since 2009, which means that Kaarina Nikunen is actually number 13 in a series of prominent scholars and practitioners who have visited our department over the year. And we are, of course, very grateful to the Under Foundation for the continuous support, the economic support to make this possible. It's a way of building network, establish new international collaborations, and in general to improve the kind of academic excellence of our research group. And of course, we are very honored that you, Kaarina Nikunen, have also accepted to come here and to be our visiting professor during this academic year. And as some of you know, Kaarina has already contributed to our discussions, giving a very good higher seminar last week, and then also yesterday, an online international seminar on migration and datafication. So I already want to thank you for your contribution to our activities. Now I want to say a few words about your research also before we start, which is also a way of motivating why we have invited you. Kaarina Nikunen is a professor, as I said, of communication and media studies at Tampere University. She is a researcher whose work is closely related to many of the areas we study in our department. Especially, there is a combined focus on mobility, migration, and globalization on the one hand, and mediatization, digitalization, and datafication on the other. So this is also where we see the kind of intersection of geo and media, I think. Nikunen's work is also concerned with questions of social justice, racism, and the role of emotions in various types of political participation. For example, she has published several articles and book chapters on the complex role of media in the refugee crisis, where she has both analyzed media coverage and conducted ethnographic research. And many of these threads come together in her most recent book, which is entitled Media Solitarities, Emotions, Power, and Justice in the Digital Age, which was published in 2019 by Sage. Nikunen's research has also appeared in international journals like Big Data and Society, European Journal of Communication, International Journal of Cultural Studies, and European Journal of Cultural Studies, and Television and New Media, and also several other important international journals. And I'm also happy to say that Nikunen is a long-standing friend of Geomedia, and you have been to our conference, you have been here lecturing before, and also contributed to the edited volume, Geomedia Studies, that we published in 2018. So I'm, for many reasons, very honored and happy to invite you to our department and to Karlstads, and a warm welcome to Professor Kaarina Nikunen.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Andre, and really it's really really an honor to be invited, of course. Rarely happens. and also to be here in Karlstad. I found this place very, very wonderful in many ways. And already I've met really wonderful new friends and colleagues here. So thank you indeed, old friends and new friends, and hopefully new academic ideas and intellectual discussions coming up. So my talk here today is titled Matters of Solidarity, Traces, Minefields and Migratory Lives in DATAFIED World. And I will talk about my previous and ongoing work in this lecture. So these two quotes that you see are from our ongoing research. I'll just read them out. I follow Facebook all the time. Facebook is also for if my mother and father can someday come and see me. I follow news from there, although the news are really bad every day, but I still follow them. Sometimes I just remove Facebook altogether because of the bad news. I just can't take it. But then I put it back again in case my mother finds me and sends a message. Yes, I worry sometimes. When you share your information, for example, your personal information, that really worries you when you share your location. That's also worse because you will never know what will happen. So these quotes are from undocumented migrants in our research describing their media relations and their use of social media, their concerns and fear of being traced through social media. So in our research, we explore the ways in which datafication affects the lives of people in precarious life situations, but also in society more largely. And the research on a whole is interested in how this affects the foundations of something that we might think as a just society. So datafication refers to the increasing and continuous gathering of data from everyday interaction and social life, from shopping, social media interactions, movement, sports, and even from our sleep, to be sold to third parties or used for algorithmic profiling, predictive analysis, and automated decision-making to create perhaps better services for us, or to enforce more efficient systems of security and surveillance, on the other hand. Datafication is often framed as a phenomenon that concerns everyone. In network digital world, datafication cannot be really escaped. However, in recent years, there's been more focus on the inequalities, vulnerabilities and algorithms of oppression that have shown that datafication does not really treat everyone in the same way. And our study on the undocumented migrants, also the unemployed and the elderly, tries to find out what kind of inequalities or new vulnerabilities datafication might entail and how we might be able to respond it in some ways. But before I embark to the current research and the ways in which it connects with matters of solidarity or the materialities of mediated solidarity, I want to go backwards in time a bit to describe three paths that have kind of led me to this research. So I know it's Friday, so I'm trying to make this kind of as easy to follow as possible. So there are these three paths that have taken me where I'm now, I think, mainly. So one of them concerns a research on satellite living, other hopes of hospitality, and the third, what I would call networks of hate. So I'll go through those first, and then I come to the current research with the DATAFIED and the undocumented, and then how that connects to the idea of matters of solidarity. Okay, so satellite living. I have worked in the field of migration and media studies quite a long time. And in 2007, I began to study media use among migrant youth. And in this research field, there was quite a lot of, or there had been quite a lot of interest in satellite TVs. Satellite TV was explored as a kind of providing new time-space constellation as transnational media. And the increase of satellite TV households in Europe from 1980s on represented this kind of new transnational media space that was seen sometimes as a kind of threat to national media space and integration, but sometimes also as an important aspect of identity and belonging. So I did ethnographic work in a local school for several months, teaching media, and I created documentary film workshops, and I also interviewed the young migrant students and tried to understand their media world that was beginning at the time transfer from analog to digital, from TVs and computer-based internet to their mobile phones and apps. And research was focused on trying to find and create spaces of belonging. This was what I was interested in. And it showed the limits of the national frame and its inability to address migrant audiences. And also how particularly the young found more resonance from the multiple forums of the internet with possibilities to meet, discuss, and create transnational communities. So these were kind of emerging as a sites where they could express identity as a both and rather than either or. And some scholars have pointed out at the time the mundane and ordinary nature of satellite TVs and this transnational media sphere, not only as being about diasporic experience, but intertwined importantly in the everyday rhythms and rituals of life in complex ways. But for me, also the ethnographic research pointed out limitations of my own position and the different kind of power relations within the research, especially in a school setting. It also underlined the kind of relevance of collaborative research design, particularly when we are researching groups that are in some ways invisible or vulnerable. So to me, it was an important lesson of research method at the time. So to the next path, and this is also something that I've written in the Geomedia book, I think. So this research is connected to borders of Europe in southern Italy, where I did ethnographic research in a small village that welcomed hundreds of migrants who had shipwrecked on the coast on their way to Europe. And the shipwreck happened in the end of 1990s, and I visited the village then, and then a couple of times later, the last time in 2011. So in Italy in 1990s and early 2000, the coast was very different from today. I remember really well how the locals explained the lack of border control and guards on the sea within a kind of 100-kilometer radar that was open to migrants to arrive in Italy, and who were also accepted or kind of ignored in a way. It didn't seem to be like a big issue at the time. Of course, it was difficult to enter Europe also at that time, and people had to take risks and use dangerous sea fart. However, there is a dramatic shift to the scale of difficulty and danger people face today. When we witnessed thousands of deaths on the coast and criminalization of people who try to help the ones who are in danger to drown. Or if we think what we see today, migrants being used as pawns of political game on the borders of Belarus, or becoming caught in between borders without access to help. So that time in the end of 90s, the world and early 2000 seemed very different. But what was particular about this case was how there was a possibility seen in hospitality, a kind of utopian future seen in the arrival of migrants who could bring life and economic success to the small village in the very southern border of Europe. And it showed the power of the ability to imagine opportunities that may carry people forward despite challenges. But then the same case study also showed the limitations of these imaginations, because the migrants who arrived, they didn't really find new jobs or futures in the village, and they moved on to the north in the same way as generations of Italians had done before them, leaving their village. So it didn't really change the economic structures of the village, and they couldn't really revitalize the place. And I think this example reminds of the abstract and idealistic levels of imagination that may remain very distant to the everyday practices and therefore also very difficult to realize. And hospitality in this case was not really founded enough on the material conditions of the everyday life. And most importantly, the municipality or the village failed to develop this kind of idea politics of hospitality together with the migrants and refugees and to hear their experiences. And the crucial question to ask here would be, who are included or granted agency in these visions and imaginations? So even if imaginations strive for social justice, they may be blind to the needs of the ones who are object of help and fail to recognize the structures that serve inequality. But all in all, I think the case showed the importance of even to try to imagine alternatives to apparently non-alternative future, both from the side of the migrants and on the side of the village. And imagine an alternative to the harsh economic values and demands of efficiency currently dominating the management of refugees and migration through DATAFIED systems in Europe. Migrants who are now seen as a kind of surplus humanity or numbers rather than lives that we should save and grieve for. So then I go to the third part. And we are coming closer to this day. So the third part depicts the rise of the nationalist, populist, far-right movements across Europe, alongside with Fortress of Europe, shaping the political map with increased affective hate speech through digital media. And my own research has been involved in the kind of way to use big data methods to explore hate speech and racism and complement that with different kinds of qualitative methods. Hate and racism are not new, of course, but many scholars point out the role of digital infrastructures and technology in enhancing and advancing hate speech, fake news and racism, giving power to the extreme right. The extreme hate groups need their own channels for unfiltered dissemination of their ideology and tools for community building. Particular elements such as moderation based on self-regulation, possibility to operate as a closed group, and anonymity, all these are seen to allow explicit racist discourse and anti-democratic values that can be used for systematic stigmatization of others. More importantly, the kind of standardization of infrastructures produce conditions for contents to travel with ease across different platforms and forums, across regions and nations, powered by algorithms, recommendations, and rankings. This is something that Josep van Dijk refers to as the frictionless sharing that keeps the circulation of news, images, and messages on the move, and it keeps the platforms profitable. And of course, as media scholars, we tend to overemphasize the role of media. Media are not, of course, the root cause or the only reason for hate speech and the rise of the extreme far right. Obviously, these are questions connected with larger issues of social, political, and economic changes, and the perhaps inherent racial inequalities in societies that haven't been really addressed. And also, we need to remember that social media environment includes so much more than hate speech. It's also about sharing friendship, family connections, laughter, and joy. However, when working in the field of migration, it is impossible to ignore the impact of hate speech in the political climate and society, and how it really affects also individuals. So based on our research, we can really clearly say that extreme far-right groups have made a very good use of the logistical aspects of platform media environment. So misinformation, fake news, polarization, hate speech, platform racism, they have now become a kind of ordinary vocabulary of media studies. And we really need to understand the foundations that they emerge from, or what they are laid on. And the image here is part of our research, where we looked at the refugee debate on social media and the most shared domains. And what we could see from that study was clearly that when we were talking in general about refugees and migrants, the most shared domains were the usual news agencies and media companies. But then when it was connected with crime or sexual harassment or sexual crime, the image changed so that the most shared domains were the ones that are connected with a kind of false or fake news sites that are not verified news. So it kind of tells you the picture of what kind of tool it is also to be used. But to go on, why these three paths? So what I wanted to highlight with these three paths was first of all the kind of drastic changes that have taken place, both in the context of mobility and migration, as well as in the context of media environment, and the ways these changes are also interconnected. The increased secretization of borders, building of walls, detention centers, migrant deaths have become part of the reality that we now live in. And this is accompanied, excuse me, by increased hateful and racist discourse and rise of extremist nationalism that is circulated in the platforms and amplified algorithmically. Media environment has moved from analog televisions and satellites to data-driven platforms that also operate as areas of everyday data gathering in our pockets as extensions of our bodily existence. So these developments of securitization, surveillance, and datafication are not only about politics and media contents, and this is what I want to point out, they are also infrastructural. And second, I wanted to point out that the lessons learned from this previous research point to the value of collaborative aspects in research, particularly when we want to explore vulnerable groups or people who are not often so visible or able to be in powerful positions. We need to be sensitive to our own position as researchers. And for example, think how my privileged whiteness affects and limits my own research. And the previous work has showed how knowledge from experience may open up new insight in research. And a guideline that I often use by Chandra Mohanty captures this well. And she says, if we form our understanding of a just society on the basis of the experience of the privileged, we are not likely to recognize the structures that further inequalities, whereas the experience of the marginalized allows for more concrete and expansive vision of universal justice. And also the ability to bear witness, to provide evidence from experience has been an important way of shedding light on lived inequality shaped by structures of discrimination. Philomena Esed, for example, argues that it would make sense to see dominant society through the eyes of those who were considered not to belong, not to be part of the norm. And this is something how we learned from. But to do that, we should also do that in a more collaborative form in our research. Also, another important aspect to that is that knowledge from experience should not explain, it should not be taken simply as an explanation, but rather create a space for reflexive interrogation, and to do that in a kind of non-essentializing way, as not to recreate categories again. And this is, of course, very challenging and hard, but really important in the kind of collaborative approach. So these insights and lessons are connected to questions of what has become of media research, how to study media, and how to do research in this current situation. And they are, of course, connected to larger questions of democracy in current media ecosystem, political economy of platforms, mechanisms of datafication, policies and power, connected to structures and decision-making practices and their implications to societies at large. So these small questions only. So, and this has actually, this is how I have found myself researching datafication. So in our current research project, Intimacy in Data-Driven Culture, IDA, we explore the ways in which datafication affects and is experienced by people in precarious life situations, and how we might somehow improve their situations or be able to impact that in some ways. Generally, datafication is approached as part of platform power, surveillance capitalism, data colonialism, for example. And I find, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, that datafication is difficult to approach in its totality, presented as a complete and closed system of power. And it is also difficult to research because it is hidden, black boxed phenomenon that remains mostly inaccessible for research and unidentified in the everyday life. So instead of looking at datafication from the point of data or the industry, as often is done, particularly in a political economy view, our study tries to apply more human-centric approach to datafication in order to understand the complex, affective, and intimate workings of it among people who are subjected to and dependent on multiple data-driven services and practices, and who may not consider data as the most pressing issue in their lives even. So the view to digital everyday life makes it possible to understand the kind of more ambiguous and contradictory experiences of datafication, as well as grant agency to those views who are not often considered central in discussion and debates of data and society. So we also, in our research, we consider datafication simultaneously abstract and mundane, intertwined in the everyday digital life as a form of intimacy, and as Lauren Berlant refers to intimacy as air that we breathe. So research on data inequalities has pointed out the ways in which migrants are subjected to various forms of surveillance and data gathering. And our research, when we are looking at focusing on the undocumented, we try to look at these kind of different forms in their everyday context. So in our work, the undocumented, with the undocumented, we see two areas of importance datafication of borders and mobility, and then datafication of digital everyday life. So there is quite a lot of work now being done on datafication of borders. And for example, recent UN report expressed concern over the ways in which borders infrastructure and processes are increasingly relying on machine learning, automated algorithmic decision-making systems, predictive analytics, and related digital technologies with ground sensors, aerial video surveillance drones, biometric databases, facial recognition systems, age detection, language detection, to identify different dialects and regions or confirm them. And of course, some of this research we actually heard yesterday also in the speaker seminar of Geomedia. So the UN report is concerned, for example, that some countries make an exemption with migrants in terms of their rights for data privacy as non-citizens. So they are not protected and able to control their data and have very little say on how that is used. And also the other thing that raises concern is that technology-driven systems are often veiled as objective and neutral, yet they do misinterpret and misrecognize data in ways that can be sometimes fatal. So these are the kind of important aspects of datafication of migration that become relevant and important in the borders. And from yesterday's discussion, for example, what we came to talk about how the borders are also changing and following us. So for example, the biometric data travels with us, and in a way, the borders are moving with the technology in different ways. But then when we look at the kind of everyday life level, the digital everyday life, after entering Europe, surveillance continues in different forms, also in the very mundane everyday life through digital devices. And to explore this, we have data with collected or created photographic exhibition and workshop with 6 participants, undocumented participants, but we have a bigger group of people, 17 participants who are part of the larger research with the undocumented, who have written diaries and who we've interviewed of their experiences of digital everyday life. So in our research, we found that the sense of being surveilled was constantly present in this group of people. The undocumented migrants in our study expressed fear for their safety on social media as a kind of semi-public space that renders them visible to unknown audiences. Surveillance by platforms, peers, governments, officials, and potentially hostile groups adds to the complexity and the multiple levels the kind of sense of surveillance operates in the digital everyday life. And to be able to live on social media, there are several tactics that are adopted, like multiple profiles are used to manage relationship with different groups and relationship in different countries. Many people have loved ones left in the country they've fled, and they also have a concern over their safety at the same time. So having multiple profiles is also kind of used to protect family and not showing something that might put them in danger. Also, many avoid using apps with location trackers in same way as avoid surveillance cameras on streets and corners with guards and the police. And in these cases, also the material conditions of digital use stand out. Because of uncertainty of connections, there is constant concern over charges, costs, and locations, and struggle for the right to be connected also when in custody or faced by the police, because often people are, their mobile phones are taken from them, and the police might also scan the data on the phone. So importantly, we have to also remember that digital infrastructures provide not only kind of sense of fear and concern, but also it is an essential infrastructure and a lifeline to imagine better lives. Also kind of joy and sense of closeness and intimacy with the loved ones is provided through these devices. However, on the whole, datafication is captured in this sense of creepiness, being surveilled, and a kind of dependency on the digital devices as infrastructures of everyday life, and something that is really very difficult to escape from. And this is discussed by Veronica Barassi as a coerced participation. So one of the greatest challenges really is how to respond to this, how to carve out spaces of possibility, and how to imagine alternatives to datafication and surveillance and platform power that seems such a totalizing terms in our everyday life. And this is where we get to closer to matters of solidarity. So my earlier work on media solidarities explored the ways in which media may operate as an arena where people may come together and engage in social debates. Media solidarities refer to the multiple ways in which media may enhance, express, evoke, and materialize solidarity. It explores new kind of forms, interaction, and sensibilities of political action that emerge from mediated performances, affiliated also with new social movements that are issue-based, flexible, many-voiced movements, operating through social media with sensibilities of affect and intimacy. But it also highlights the limitations of such mediated solidarities in algorithmic and data-driven media environment. But really the book was driven by the desire to see alternatives and also to acknowledge the way people are engaged in media in productive ways, and how people try to find some kind of ways to engage with others and the world. So I've often said that this book is critical, but it's not cynical, in the sense that I don't want to think that there is nothing can be done, but instead try to find ways to do something. And in current datafied systems of profit, it has become clear that approaches to media in terms of solidarity and justice need to dive deep and address the very foundations of media, the infrastructure and technological designs that channel and enable media content and participation. So I have started to think more about the matter of solidarity, the material dimension of mediated solidarity. And the concept of material solidarity sheds light to the increasing power and significance of structures and materialities of media that often remain hidden or unrecognized from the audiences. The material approach strives to undo black boxing, apply reverse engineering with emphasis on experiments, errors, recycling, collaboration, in the same way as a kind of maker culture has done before, and different kinds of technological activism has tried to do. So it kind of touches upon that area of research. It challenges hidden mechanisms of media, not only for the purpose of making them visible, but also in order to identify the structures of inequality and biases embedded in technology and design in the hidden structures of media, sort of under the hood. And the aim is to broaden the scope of exploration from media content to the infrastructural solutions and technologies that are designed, developed, and contested in what is also called the media backends, in the back room. It focuses on the struggles for equality, enhancing trying to find and enhance ethical technologies as alternatives to datafication and surveillance. So while material approach pays attention to the hidden forces of media, objects, and technologies, it also raises awareness of the ways in which media shape and impact environments and the wider world. So the extent to which the information economy is indebted to physical realities, labor markets, working conditions, environmental energy use, raw material, and waste production. It sheds light to the production of digital technologies with the mindset of European colonial past, with control of territory, installation of infrastructure, extraction of raw materials, exploitation of human labor, and exercise of power for the benefit of technology companies and their economic success. An increasing amount of research highlights the environmental consequences of media and tech industry. In Greening the Media, Maxwell and Miller, for example, argue that our enchantment with media technologies and emphasis on the symbolic power of media have prevented us from perceiving the media's material connection to ecological crises. Wastelands of wires, laptops, mobile phones, cables, and screens, gaping holes, and polluted waters left by mineral quarries are manifestations of the global inequalities instantiated through media industries and digital networks. And the growing digital underclass, which has been well documented in the book Ghost Work, take care, clean, and maintain the dirty, broken, and routinized parts and contents of media platforms while receiving minimum wages and little legal production. They are the human labor powering many mobile phone apps, websites, and artificial intelligence systems, increasingly outsourced to the global south. So exploring material solidarity requires a holistic view to the fairness of media to the world it consumes. It relates to the notion of precarious life by Judith Butler, which may be discussed on a symbolic level and experienced on material level by asking the fundamental question of whose life is worth saving. In other words, material solidarity addresses and explores the combination of environmental and human inequalities connected to digital media and datafication, and to the ways in which manufacture and consumption of media render some lives and their contexts more valuable than others, and seeks to find ways to undo those inequalities. So this research approach seeks to show in a way that solidarity is profoundly connected to the cables and rare earths in the software design and in the human labor that builds minds, maintains, and consumes them. So to the alternatives then. As a response and resistance to the growing power of these kind of closed systems of profit in media and digital media particularly, a range of movements, manifestos, and initiatives have been launched with the aim of opening up, repairing, and rebuilding media systems while questioning their datafied grounds. So new research on design justice, anti-racist technology, data justice, slow computing, and AI have become focusing on how to challenge technologies of inequality and how to create and imagine alternatives to those systems of oppression. And often these initiatives work as a kind of collaborative and creative practices. For example, design justice aims to open up digital design processes and to kind of challenge and reproduce new ways to use these technologies. And these movements and manifestations draw attention to media infrastructure and technology as something that we might imagine as a public good that should be designed for all. So in the context of digital media and platforms, it often evokes a kind of spatial metaphor of platforms and social media forums as arenas, parks, or squares that are accessible and safe to everyone. The research design then would need to understand the inequalities inscribed in history and approach them through, and all these, I think, or most of these projects really emphasize the kind of collaborative grassroots practices by design and imagine alternatives, and do that with practices of dialogue and listening. And for example, design justice uses feminist theorizations that pay attention to situatedness, experience, collaboration as a relevant avenues to further equality, solidarity, and social justice. So not to take the public good as something self-evident, but really root it to lived experience and the understanding of difference in a very reflexive way. So this is the broad picture and the direction of research. But of course, this is a huge task for any research to do, clearly impossible. We can't solve all these problems with one study. It rather points towards a kind of aspiration and a task that we might give to ourselves as researchers, asking, how is my research connected to these matters of solidarity? How can this research that I'm doing, how can that unpack or recognize the digital inequalities? And I think of that as a kind of offering one piece to the puzzle. And here is the puzzle. Some of you might recognize that. So what would this mean in our project? In our project, experience of datafication among the undocumented is in complex ways connected with the systems of datafication in migration management and everyday life with different media practices, but also different services. So our next step and what we want to do next is to approach designers, public institutions, and officials to explore their understanding of the DATAFIED infrastructure. And from there, start to imagine how digital systems might operate as public goods with kind of small steps, trying to find safe practices, exposing data leakages, malfunctioning bots, and different kinds of data biases. And also, of course, we have to connect with different studies and movements on the way, because at the moment, I feel that there are so many initiatives going on in research, but also on the level of European Union with the Digital Markets Act, Digital Service Act, that are trying to redefine through legislation the digital media environment and the power of platforms in ways that can be actually very influential. So we need to think how our work also connects to these larger initiatives that are going on. And of course, we want to do this in collaboration with the people we work with who are participating in our research from the knowledge that comes from their experiences. So to understand that we cannot ignore digital infrastructures is one point, and we need to explore that from grassroots level as well as on the level of institutions, industries, governments, to understand the sort of complexity of it. And the aim is to do research that theoretically opens up the closed systems of datafication, but also do that empirically, open up, disclose, and try to create some spaces of possibilities and alternatives. And most importantly, do the research in ways that is really meaningful for the ones who participate in it, for the ones who walk with us in this world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this inspiring and very, very interesting lecture. How are we to go about this now? Are we taking questions from both online?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. So those of you who are online, you can write questions in the chat, and the other questions will be post here, and you have a microphone, Lena. So there is some time for asking questions. Yeah, Raul, please.
Yeah, thank you, Kaarina. Very, very, very interesting and inspiring, really. My question is more about whether you can talk a little bit about how to keep that cynicism from creeping in, right? Like you showed a little bit about that point of resistance, which I really admire, but the scale tilts towards the other end, right? And your work into trying to link race with methods is great, and thinking about these topics from a more of a social or human perspective. But the more that we look in, these are continue to be processes that come from a specific mind of frame, data sovereignty, and just another way of exploitation. When you were talking about the book, I thought like, well, a book on media solidarities has to be a very short book. And I wonder from the perspective of somebody who has been thinking about these things is, what do you do or suggest others to do in order not to fall to the despair, to the thinking that there's nothing to do but just resist? It's almost like we can never go back to the rejoice, right? So if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. I'm sure many of us struggle with that, really. I mean, I don't think it's very easy to think about kind of to keep that cynicism away. But I have to say that I think I've seen a lot of developments happening, and I think that can be inspiring when you see the work that's been done. For example, the ones that I showed that are being done in the many of them in the US context, but then also in Europe, there are initiatives and groups that are working really hard. And if you look at the European legislation, they've asked kind of advice and consultation from groups that are like the algorithmic awareness group and so on, that I think are in a very good position in that sense. So that gives hope. And I also know that many, when you get involved with the kind of policymaking people, there are a lot of things that are happening, like very small things, but it's not a complete sort of, it's not something that you can't influence in. And I think sometimes I'm quite angry about the totalitarian view of the datafication that we get in the academic literature, as it's something that's happening at the same pace everywhere, and because that's not necessarily the case. So so there are these kind of developments happening, and maybe that's a Nordic perspective to that, because in the Nordic countries there is quite a lot of work done on the ethical technologies and legislation and these kind of things. But there's always also this sort of concern that the markets, we will lose the markets. If we make rules, then we will lose everything. And people who, the business and startups are crumbling down and this kind of view. But I think it can also be turned the other way around, that there is now so much. I think that Trump's presidency in many ways was horrible, but it also showed, it made people to think and act in a new way. So I think there is a concern, there's a lot of concern about how these technologies work. And it can also be an asset for developers and to find that as a kind of driving moment, for example, in Europe. That's one possibility. And I've been working previously with the public service media, YLE, in Finland. And I think that was inspirational, how the people inside there were sort of really engaging with this issue. But I mean, of course, the world is a gloomy place and the money has the power. There's no denying of that. But as a researcher, I can't just repeat that everything's really bad. I have to find some ways out of there. And I guess this is the way that I've discovered so far.
May I have a related question to this? Because I think also to some extent there is a risk that this type of resistance becomes a very elitistic undertaking, that because it demands such enormous amount of skill, expertise in various fields to conduct what you refer to as slow computing and design justice and alternative designs and so on. So do you have any ideas of how we can reach beyond that and turn into something more than something which is only for a particular very privileged group of people, actually, which is still, it may be grassroots, but it's still a privileged position to have.
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems, that these sort of alternatives are often thought in, exactly what you said, in a very elitist, highly educated groups. There are some examples in the US, and the work by Zeta Gangadharan, for example, is quite interesting, how they developed or they did research with different communities, quite poor communities in different cities in the US, and try to work there together to create some new practices. But it was also very much about media literacy. And I think that danger of this sort of elitism is always there. But this is, for example, what I've been thinking, the public service media, hello, do you exist? Wake up. This is the wake-up call, because if I think about Europe, we have a very good network of public service media, and in the Nordic countries particularly, they are powerful companies that could do a lot, and they are actually doing some things, like developing public service algorithm, which is one very small, modest thing. But I think the public service media could do something more in this field, because I think they are also threatened by the commercialization of the whole field and the platformization in many ways. So yeah, I think there are ways, but it's really true. I agree that it can be really elitist, and then also not necessarily connecting to this kind of grassroots level. So even if the public service media would decide to do something, there's no guarantee they would do it in a kind of really good way, but rather with the paternalistic vision, which I would not want to see. But yeah, this is a problem, absolutely. But I think there are initiatives that are trying to at least do different things. Often small scale, though.
Yeah, one more question.
Thank you very much, Kaarina. This was also very interesting to listen to. And I was thinking also then about our role and our responsibilities as researchers for the lack of solidarity, perhaps then in the world. And if I interpret you correctly, there has been too much focus perhaps on the abstract, on datafication as something abstract, and the ways in which we have also perhaps paid too much attention to network analysis and those kinds of methods at the expense of more ethnographic research where you really get your hands dirty, perhaps. So maybe then what we need to see is some kind of material turn again, the 2.0 or something like that. But then I can't help but, even though I appreciate the bottom-up perspective and think about our responsibilities, I also cannot help but think about what kind of responsibilities then the research funders would have for encouraging that kind of research, because for a long period of time there has been this innovation imperative that we should apply digital methods to everything, and the more innovative we can be when it comes to that, the more the possibility that we get funding. So do you think that perhaps you talked about Trump and how you could even see something positive in that, perhaps even then like the climate crisis that also forces us to think more about the planet, the material, other people, that perhaps could also push research funders as well in such a material turn direction again? And I don't know if I have a question in this, but it's more a reflection from your very interesting presentation with, and I share a lot of your viewpoints on this. So thank you. I don't know if you want to reflect on anything about
Yeah, I can. Thank you, Kaarina. I think really relevant things to say about, well, first of all, the funders and yeah, I know there's a lot of pressure to do, and especially the sort of having to do research really quickly and efficiently. You know, we have these technological tools that we could use them and then publish like 7 times the same paper with a little bit different angle. That sort of academic efficiency that's kind of being demanded, which is really very far away from what I think would be meaningful research. And but I think it can be also turned the other way around. So, you know, we can use technologies, we can use innovation, but we have to kind of, for example, in our project, when we applied funding for datafication, we applied it for this very human-centric aspect. And I think sometimes that can be the innovation, that you don't look the obvious, you do it in a different way. And I've used quite a lot of these digital tools in different research, but combine them with different ones. So I think they can be good, but they need to be sort of combined and opened up in some ways. I've never really believed that one way to do research is you know, we should all do the same thing. That would be mad, and you know, it wouldn't improve our research on a whole. It's very good that people do different things, but yeah, I think it's always good to ask that question about the meaningfulness of the research for the ones that it's kind of, you know, exploring, and for kind of society. I think that's a good question to pose, and there's no direct answer, but I think that's something we always have to ask.
Thank you.
Yes, Lena.
Thank you, Kaarina, for a really nice talk. I have a question related to your ongoing project. That is also related to the work I do about migrants and their media use for homemaking and belonging. And in the interviews I've done, there's no mention of the fear of surveillance and things like that. So do you have any sense of when the feeling of surveillance and fear in the use of social media turn to something that is only beneficial for homemaking and belonging?
Well, yeah, really a good question. In our research, these are people who are undocumented, and I think that makes a big difference because they live in fear to be found. They have to hide. And you see the difference immediately when somebody gets their residence permit. They feel that they have no fear anymore. So it's very much connected also to that situation. But then we also have groups of people who are, for example, one of the groups that we study are elderly, and then we have unemployed. So they also want to they are cautious with the with the social media. So I think this is also something that you don't necessarily find it in an ordinary research that just asks questions about media use, but when you kind of dig a little bit deeper or listen to the reluctance to show everything, or especially with the elderly, they don't want to show pictures of their grandchildren. They protect the grandchildren because they feel that there's something there that they are afraid of. And often the fear is very abstract, or then it might be someone, that there is someone there. So there's no precise thing that people are cautious about, but they are cautious. There is a sense that it's not entirely safe space. But yeah, going back to that migrants and how that it really relates to their status in the society. Yeah, and their legal status.
Do you think that it is a distinct point that comes with the permit to stay? Or
well,
is it a transformance?
I think for some people it's a really clear point when their attitude changes and they feel that they have no fear. But then, of course, they still have loved ones in different countries. They fear those being exposed to some things. And so having multiple profiles, for example, is not only about being undocumented. It's also about, what you have left behind and those things. Yeah, so it works in a very complex ways.
All right. Do we have any questions in the chat? No? Okay. So if there are no more questions, I think we can close this part of the event. But it's not really over, because for us who are here physically, there will be a little gathering. We can mingle and there will be some refreshments, and that's served in building 12 in the main square. And to the rest of you, those of you who are online, we can just say thank you for your attention and have a nice weekend. You as well. And of course, a very warm thank you again to Kaarina for this wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you.